I'm sure that all of you, well, most of you have been here before, and most of you know what an incredible place Oglethorpe is. Some alums are here, and some professors are here, and longtime members of the museum are here, and friends of Jordan are here, and it's a small group. But, you know, Oglethorpe is small but mighty, and every single person, just like every little piece of the fractal project, every person is really integral. And it's so, it's typically Oglethorpe that a student can take advantage of so many opportunities. So they say, you know, youth is wasted on the young. Not this young woman. Absolutely not. So I'm going to read to you here so I don't miss anything that I've got on her little list. Most recently, she received a full scholarship to go to Japan and study at Obirin, the Obirin Gakuen Foundation. She's an international studies major with a Japanese minor. She was the curatorial assistant on this exhibit and works for us here in the museum, and was hired as a freshman. That doesn't happen, right? She's very, very involved here as an admissions ambassador, also the vice president of COEXIST, the OU chapter, secretary of SGA. What else are you doing? Resident Hall Association president, and a member of Tri Sigma, and the president of the Society of Japanese Language Students. The list goes on, but that is really wonderfully, typically Oglethorpe, that if you realize what kind of power you have as a student and the opportunities you can take advantage of, you can shine like nobody's business. Beyond all that, she's just a kind person and a pleasure and a lovely person to know. So now that I've embarrassed you, I'm sure you're going to do a beautiful job. Jordan Michels.
Hello, everybody. As Ms. Peterson said, my name is Jordan Michels. I'm a third year here at Oglethorpe University. I'm an international relations major with a minor in Japanese, with a bit of concentration in museum studies. Can everybody in the back hear me all right? I just want to make sure volume is good. Okay, awesome. So this is actually my first lecture in front of an audience this size. And it's the first time I've stood up in front of people in quite a while, so please go easy on me. I was actually really surprised to walk in to see so many people, so I truly thank you all for coming out tonight. That said, if you could change the slide for me. Tonight I'm going to be talking to you about Japanese identity and the very open definition of Orientalism, which throughout this talk is going to be referred to as certain attributes or characteristics representative of Asia, defined by Western Europe, which are portrayed in a stereotypical or appropriative way. Identity, on the other hand, as any philosophy professor can tell you, is a little more complicated. But for this talk, we'll leave it as the voice of people translated into tangible actions, which can be art, movements in literature, pop culture, as well as changes in economic and political policy, as demanded by the people of the given nation, in this case, Japan. Several other terms may come into play, such as Japanism and Westernization, which at some point may conflict with the definitions I just gave you. I bring this to your attention not to contradict myself over and over again, but rather to illustrate how difficult it is to find just the right words when discussing the exchange of ideas and artistic technique in the context of political states, and the greater divide between East and West. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this subject. It's actually not even my concentration, so my knowledge is of that of a student, at most. But if there's anything I've learned at my time here at Oglethorpe, it's that in the academic world, there are very real, established, and open spaces to have dialogue about Western ideals, philosophy, art, and the like. But very rarely are spaces granted to discuss those ideals in their own format unique to the East and the greater world, so Africa, South America. This is perhaps because these ideals don't translate very easily, regardless of topic. Parallels are very difficult to find, and they tend to come with a very ugly or unclear history. My choice of topic, therefore, was actually born out of this dilemma, taking what may appear to be a softer approach through art, but in hope that this discussion will give you all a little more insight to exactly how Japanese art experienced a very sudden change in purpose during the Meiji era, in reaction to a long-running history of Oriental exports to the West, and why pinpointing this particular change can give a little bit of background to the role of Orientalism in the expression of early and modern Japanese identity. You could change the slide for me. As the lecture title states, the time period we will be dealing with is that of the Meiji era, which ran from the late 1860s up until the fall of the emperor in 1912. Now, history books will tell you that this period was one of reformation and change, as shown here in the adoption of the Meiji Constitution in the late 1880s. But what we pinpoint here as fundamental changes in the political and economic spheres, and of course, the arts community, had been developing for quite some time. A unique relationship had arisen between Japan and the growing Western presence in East Asia. Alongside it, a tension had formed, a tension that was really no stranger to the arts community scattered throughout Asia at the time. Now, the impact this key era on products and of the art, the impact that this key era had on the products and of the art produced during this time is still relevant. But while the Meiji era came to an end around 1912, the evolution and blending of that technique never halted. As you can see, just by being in this room, actually, if you'll take a moment to look around at our beautiful exhibition, we see the handiwork of both Eastern and Western artists, many of them of mixed origin. These examples, like the pieces we're going to look at tonight, leading up to the fall of the Meiji era and the few photographs after, encompass elements and motif derived not just from a distinct national history of Japan, but the very human exchange between artists internationally. If you could change the slide for me. To get to this point, we're going to look at not Japanese history alone, but its reputation, or supposed aesthetic, as interpreted by European artists of the 19th and 20th century. While the influence of cultures can't exactly be traced, especially with Japan, which was never colonized under Western power, we know that the first point of contact Japanese art had with the West was through ceramics. If you could change the slide. Imari pottery made its mark on the elite of Europe as a prized collection piece in the 18th and 19th centuries, despite Japan being sealed from the outside world, accessible only through a minor trade port in Nagasaki. Imari pottery and Imari ceramics, specifically of the Gakuen style, were instrumental in drawing attention from the West, triggering a fixation by Western consumers, many artists, for all things Eastern. However, it wasn't until the late 1800s that we see the first sign of Japanese influence on Western art, thanks to the opening of Japan in the 1950s under the treaty, as we all know, of Commander Perry. The opening of Japan marked a very sudden surge of Japanese goods on the international market. The Paris, I'm going to butcher this, the Paris Exposition Universelle, or as we call it, the World Fair, held in 1867, featured Japanese-style dress, woodblock prints, fans, umbrellas, really all things that they saw as Eastern and attractive. All of these things became fashion trends, collection trends, and were desired by everyone in the West. They also served as inspiration for artists including Claude Monet and Vincent van Gogh. If you could change the slide. So what started out as a luxury collection good quickly became commonplace in shops throughout Europe and actually spread into the Western, or the Eastern European region as well. Reproduction of woodblock prints, many dated ukulele images, were produced purely for Western export. Images of the floating world, as well as reprints of day-to-day life of the Edo period, which many of you may be familiar with when you think of woodblock prints of Japan, established them as the face of the West, or the face of Japan in the West. If you could change the slide for me. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this image. It was at this point that the notion of Japanism took a quick turn, having been coined in Japan's 200 years of seclusion. Suddenly, Eastern imagery, not just patterns and likeness, made its way into the works of Western artists, and obsession with the Far East grew. Surprisingly enough, though, many traditional art forms in Japan were actually experiencing a slow decline. Ukiyo-e's peak period during the late 17th and 18th centuries prepared the nation for its Western opening and the demand that would become of these woodblock prints. With many of the late Edo period works ready to make their way into the international market in the 19th century, attention in the West didn't dwindle. However, it didn't require woodblock artists to continue with new designs. Rather, it gave power to the printers, many of which in the West were being produced without permission of artists, as demand for a variety of prints grew exceedingly high, which created an interesting disparity between creative output in Japan versus the economic output of a rapidly developing country. This issue was not unique to wood-bought prints, and as guilds and schools of traditional Japanese art formed all over the nation, they began experiencing a very sudden decline in enrollment and of patrons as well. If you could change the slide for me. Instead, images like this woodblock, original on the left, Van Gogh version on the right, the original done by Master Hiroshige in the mid-1800s, gained fame largely in the West as a reprint, where mass prints were made available, sometimes unbeknownst to the artist in Japan. To the right, the rendition by Van Gogh actually has a border of text from other prints, and we're unsure if he actually knew their meaning at the time. So to further complicate the matter, changes in the political, economic, and social spheres of Japan began its Meiji transition into a more Western form of government, but within which developed a division between competing European art schools and traditional Japanese schools of art. In fact, under the Meiji government, Westernization was formally endorsed as a modernizing campaign. If you could change the slide for me. With the introduction of oil painting using materials that weren't native to Japan, schools of yoga, literally Western-style painting, were established. Particularly talented students were actually given the chance to study abroad, expecting to return to Japan with a better understanding of aburae, or oil painting. If you could change the slide for me. Thank you. The rise in practice and consumption of Western technique, coupled with the already declining enrollment and support for Japanese art schools, posed a great threat not only to art communities, but to the very survival of traditional art forms. If you could change for me then. Select schools were established in the capital, within which the very look of Japanese art began to evolve itself. This, coupled with the increase in Western schools, caught the attention of author and metropolitan Okakura. Okakura began as a scholar and later co-founder of the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. He was extremely active in his challenging of Western influence, not only in his home nation of Japan, but as an international delegate for East Asian art in the United States, France, Germany, and all over Europe. In a world dominated by Western culture, his views were considered very radical, especially in the West, but are still cited today as a trigger for one of the most successful pushbacks against Western influence. If you could change the slide. So this is Mr. Okakura. His expression, I think, really speaks for his approach, if I can say in the least. In his novel, The Awakening of Japan, he wrote, if you could change the slide, "We have become so eager to identify ourselves with European civilization instead of Asiatic that our continental neighbors regard us as renegades, nay, even as the embodiment of the white disaster itself." So some pretty harsh words we have here. And this was put out in one of his later novels, about 10 years before his death. So, the peak of his anger. Okakura's primary message, however, was one of warning. That buried underneath the haste that the Japanese government and people were taking during this era to join the modern world was taken at the sacrifice of Japanese culture itself. That, in embracing Westernization as the only way for Japan to catch up economically to its competitors, the living heritage of the culture had been put at risk. Physically, with the decline in traditional art forms such as theater and ceremony, and mentally, with the desire to adopt to a more Western framework, socially and later politically, as we will see towards the close of the Meiji era. Okakura's words resonated with some, but the true role he played in the revival of Nihonga, or Japanese-style painting, close to the turn of the 20th century. Sorry, I lost my train of thought very quick. Nihonga, I'll go back to that, literally translates to Japanese-style painting, but it was coined long before this time. But it was brought back specifically to include traditional forms of two-dimensional Japanese art, involving techniques, materials, and inspiration native to Japan compared to the oil paintings of the West, which required the importation of brushes, paints, even canvas. It was a living practice of traditions, some dating back as far as 1,000 years. It was specifically titled to designate or to distinguish itself as what was uniquely Japanese and not of that of Western origin. It's important to note, however, that the phrase itself was not coined at the time or by Okakura. Some people like to say that he is the savior, or the title is dedicated to him, but he's just credited with the revival of the category, founded specifically to establish itself as the indigenous and proper Japanese art style. If you could change slide. So, the call to action from patriots such as Okakura came in the form of formal education. Schools were founded in and around cultural centers in southern and central Japan, this one specifically in Tokyo, concentrating on Nihonga style, while still giving some space for Westerners and the practice of yoga or Western style painting to have their time and space as well on the formal university scale. During this time, during these places, the very look of Japanese art was actually evolving, which hadn't been given proper space as it had in the past to express and to produce and to give its face to the West. So by the late 1880s, Western style had actually been banned from public view due to efforts of Okakura and like-minded artists. And artists who practiced and continued to go along the Western style were actually denounced by Japanese critics. Nihonga, on the other hand, continued to prosper, and the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, founded in part by Okakura, who was actually the first dean, formally merged with the School of Music to form the current-day Tokyo University of Arts, which to this day actually offers concentrated programs in Japanese-style painting, handcraft, and traditional design. Tension between yoga and Nihongo, however, was short-lived, when in the early 1990s an agreement between the two schools was made under the Japanese Art Academy, which promoted mutual recognition between the two groups and inspired, actually, within the active years of Okakura, the blending of Japanese styles and that of European Romanticism. If you could change the slide. The turning point in the Meiji era was key, not only in preserving the cultural heritage of Japan, but in acknowledging that the Japanese aesthetic itself was evolving, and that it would soon be brought to attention on a global scale in the 20th century. Coming into the new century, cooperation between yoga and Nihonga artists and schools, as well as smaller sects of Chinese and indigenous people practicing in Japan, helped reconcile Japanese traditions, many of which were at risk of going obsolete, like completely, prior to the foundation of Nihonga schools. So, pretty good news for everybody involved. However, towards the end of the Meiji era, the end of the Meiji era was marked not only with a shift towards a Western-style government, democracy, but with the pressing matter of Westernization within a now social and economic spheres. If you could change the slide here. As you can see, I know it's hard to see, but this is actually the constitution that was put in this time. If any of you have ever looked at a chart of our American government, pretty similar. The result was now a third push to modernize Japan. And it was paired with a world plagued by war, out of which arose a very interesting cultural compromise, or balance between the nationalistic tendency to hold close to traditional values and the understanding that in order to compete on a global scale, Japanese leaders would have to push their nation to a new extreme, economically and for military defense. And in doing so, they would actually rewrite the way Japanese society would function, which of course includes the art communities. The country dedicated itself to a level of industrialization unparalleled in the Meiji era, and expression was limited largely to literature and art for export, once again. If you could change slide. Largely due to military conflict, there was little support for traditional art outside the university system. Though visual theater actually did see a rise in popularity during this time, so kabuki and whatnot actually did gain a little bit of attention. Once again, though, Japan felt itself default into a Western model, this time without the support of the foreign investment in its arts. You can change slide. The nation's heritage is thought of to be a sum of its history, more so than what's written in books, because it's tangible through storytelling, painting, and dance. If not more so than other nations, the Japanese identity exists within its art. The Japanese aesthetic is present in all forms of daily life, in dress, in business, and of the presentation of the self. If you could change slide. Over the past 3 decades, Japan has become more tourism reliant, but its exports have returned to a heightened popularity. But export have returned to a heightened popularity like they were in the Meiji era, but it's actually extended outside of the arts community. So specifically, Japan has gone from the Made in Japan stickers to their cultural media becoming more commonplace in the world. For example, in the United States, it's not too uncommon to think of the gaming and animation industry, and of course technology when you think of Japan. Over the past 2 centuries, we've seen the rise, fall, and multiple phases of revival of traditional art forms, some of which date back to the 1700s. So very, very traditional, very, very classic forms of art. But to what extent can we say that traditional expression is secure? Or can we even say that at all? Between the quality and content of art produced for export compared to the quality and content of art produced under the effort of something like the Nihonga movement, which is more authentic to a nation? So the question I want to pose to you all is this. Without the supposed fixation by the West on the East, not just by artists, but of lay collectors and consumers, would the nationalist reaction during the Meiji era, particularly in the art community, ever have been triggered? Or if it had, to what extent? And without it, would we have not just global viewing access, but the living practice of traditional Japanese art forms to the extent that we have today? Simple answer is, we don't know. With every day that passes, the cultures of our world are becoming more and more intertwined, blending and sometimes bouncing off each other in a variety of ways. Many are unbeknownst to us and the artists themselves. And although today we see the very active and growing community of artists in and out of Japan gaining support for traditional and modern art forms, one has to wonder, what exactly is the role of tourism, a form of modern fixation, modern Western fixation, and other forms of fiscal support for the art community on an international level play in the preservation of a culture? So, thank you all. I'll be happy to take questions. I know it's a very specific subject, so I'll be happy to take critique as well. So then I'll jump at once.
Good job.
Well, do you know, this is not a question, it's a comment. Do you know what American contributed to the revival of kabuki?
Kabuki itself?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, actually.
President Grant. President U.S. Grant.
Wow.
He played a major role in that. He visited Japan after his presidency. And they didn't know what to show him. They had all these things, and they said, well, let's show him some of this traditional theater, which nobody likes anymore. And he looked at me and said, this is great. And people said, oh, well, it's so great, maybe we should revise it.
Yeah, it's surprising. When I was actually looking and trying to find art during the 1940s and 50s, which we all know was a very sensitive time globally, I found 2 forms of art: propaganda posters and theater. And so I obviously went more towards the theater. Because it's attractive to see, you see this little blip in period where it's not paid attention to at all. And then suddenly, someone caught attention of it, someone with money and someone with fame, and here it is. And now it's one of the top things that come to head in Japan.
One comment and one question. The comment is, be careful of any art that you find after 1945 until about 1955 or so, because it was all being, it was all under the rubric or the control of SCAP.
Oh.
So a lot of the novels, like I remember when I was in college, I had to read the Burmese Heart, and it didn't really fit in with what the professor was trying to tell, because they had to get past the censors with SCAP. But the question is, as I noticed you mentioned in the Meiji era, a lot of the visual art took a downplay, but a lot of the performance art did not. Did you find any information specific to kamishibai, or the use of storytelling with posters?
Not specifically. The phrase itself isn't familiar to me. But in a particular article I was reading, actually this one here, there was a brief mention in the article about the art of storytelling in the heart of a city, and how, you know, in traditional Japanese society, that is a way to spread news and story and folklore, and how there were actual activists at that time who came into the heart of the city and would preach about, kind of like Okakura did, the threat of westernization, which may, I guess, parallel that kind of storytelling effort, but no, I didn't find anything specifically through the postcard. Yes, this one over here.
I was wondering if you could comment a bit on what initiated, what was behind the move in the 1890s to put the two art forms together under the one school that you were talking about.
The art community at that time at a university level was very small. When I actually looked at a map of the universities that were founded of yoga, Western style, and Nihonga, of Japanese style, they were not only neighbors, but they were in the same building. So, you know, there were professors with very strong opinions teaching across the hall from each other. No, we never see that these days. It's very rare. So to see that, I was wondering, you know, like, of course, at some point they had to talk to each other, but they didn't. So it wasn't until the Japanese Art Academy actually came in and had an open forum between professors of the same schools talk and say, you know, even if you're not talking, your students are, and your students are exchanging different techniques. And because of that, whether you like it or not, whatever the syllabus says, at the end of the semester, you're going to have to look at pieces that have romanticism in it. You're going to have to look at yoga-style pieces that use native Japanese material. And I think those, actually the students and their actions in art kind of pushed that, that dialogue along. But it was a very short period of tension. So when looking at it, you know, they talk about conflict, but it only goes for maybe 7 to 10 years when it's actually, you know, documented tension in the art community. Because that, I believe, was in 1904 that it was agreed that they would merge. So, I saw another hand somewhere. Yes.
Is there a new rule on references? I notice you always include when you retrieve the document. Is that something in the rule book now?
I put it, I'm not sure if it is in all standard citations, but I put it because 2 of the links actually were edited since I retrieved them. So I always keep the date because you never know when the title is going to go. Because most of these are online references, so they can go down in a second. Yes.
So I have a question, but I have to give a little bit of a preface first.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So in the 16th, 17th century, especially in China, later with Japan, when they were exporting porcelain wares into the West, they would often send the absolute worst of the worst because we didn't know any better.
Right.
And Elizabeth I would treasure them like gold. But my question is, by the time of the Exposition Universelle in Paris, in the second half of the 19th century, when Japan was sending things to state-sponsored events like that, nationally sponsored events, was there a greater emphasis on the caliber and quality of the work being shown in terms of nationalistic pride, or were they trying to get one over on us again?
The way you put it in saying that what Japan sent over, Japan wasn't sending anything over. Japan was allowing Westerners to come in, purchase what they thought was pretty,
And take it over.
and bring it over to France. So one could say that it was the same standard, especially because in the places that spoke the European languages were able to transfer payment exchange. Were probably the same families, same areas, same shops that were during the export in the 1600s. Like I mentioned, the Dutch port at Nagasaki, that was actually up until like 1900s a very popular place for American, British, and German and French collectors to come, pick and choose what they like, pay a very high price for it, which they could get 5 miles north, and bring it back and sell it. If that answers your question.
Does.
So when the Nihonga people reacted against the yoga people, so how were they defining what's Japanese?
That's a very good question, and one that I struggled with all of this. Largely it was defined by the materials being native to Japan, so the absolute no oil painting, quick dry, and then also picking up particular art forms, so woodblock, the use of the revival, actually, of ukiyo-e style imagery, calligraphy was also taught, and then of course in literature there were completely different categories in schools that taught writing, if that answers your question. But defining what is truly Japanese is something that they struggled with because, as even I saw in researching this, the Japanese aesthetic was evolving throughout all of this. And while we have, documented ukiyo-e imagery in the Edo period over to the ukiyo-e imagery in the early 1900s, there's a big gap there, and we don't necessarily have record of all that. So you see a very distinct change in the art between them there.